Other people who may be coming later are from the Harvard Advocate. And my roommate and I built this building on 21 South Street, which is the building of the Harvard Advocate now. Later on, I got involved in a lot of entrepreneurial things. One of them, after Basic Systems, was a conference center company. And we took over an estate with 47 fireplaces. And it was a summer White House. And then I got my doctorate in '72 on question asking, going from behavioral psychology, focusing mainly on the observable body, to cognitive psychology and understanding the ideational scaffolding of the mind. In 1981, some 36 years ago, I got a new view of a two-dimensional with the creative brain that Ned Herman was doing. He was General Electric. General Electric was trying to get more Thomas Edisons to be creative and innovative, and they were asked him to figure out a tool, and he used the research on the brain at that time to come up with something called the Herman Brain Dominance Instrument that gives you a wonderful way of looking, which we'll look at tonight. Later on, I began trying my hand at writing papers to show how this idea of how to understand the mind based on the brain could turn into a data-based learning system. How could we store all the materials that Murin gave me in a database so we could categorize them, organize them, strategize, and then plagiarize our own work so that we would have a way of reusing and not having to reinvent the wheel. In 2011, after I had a wonderful life, suddenly on New Year's Eve, I got black eyes, and I managed to climb out of the back seat of that car with a backflip the car was on fire in the middle of nowhere in New Hampshire, and that was the beginning of the troubles. I thought I'd seen fire and rain, but I hadn't seen this before. Then in the summertime, after different surgeries, on August 1st, I had a party out here on this terrace, and I got bit by a mosquito. Turned out to be West Nile virus.
Oh my God.
And a week later, I went from playing 7 sets of tennis a weekend to this.
That picture, just show them the picture, you in the hospital bed. Oh.
Yeah, and it would look like it was all over. I realized that during the time that I was barely coming back to life and seeing my brain was fried with encephalitis, my body was paralyzed with the equivalent of poliomyelitis, respiratory failure, and I realized that the only thing I had left was my mind, which Skinner said was a 4-letter word. So I had been working on a creative problem-solving process, so now called the Atkinson protocol. I had been working on a memory system because I could never remember everything. I was good at experiments and problem solving, but I couldn't remember the rules, nor did I often follow. But anyway, I think of the people here, Murin was the one who came to my 80th birthday party, where I was back at the Flight Club and had 160 people. Since that time, I've been reading a lot of books, like this Grain Brain, which shows you how paleo diets work. And that's how I connected with Carol, because she really is an expert in executive health care. And another guy at Harvard, class of '68, wrote a book called The Future of the Mind. And then I found that Raymond Kurzweil, the singularity guy, had been wrote a book called How to Create a Mind. But it wasn't to create a mind for people, it was to replace our minds with a mind in a computer. and wanted to know how the mind worked. I saw that and I said, I'm going to create a mind for people. That'll match him against the exponential acceleration of technology. Then last summer, there were projects going along on science, and in my older age now, I really feel that I'm much more interested now that I can't play tennis, but I can play the piano and can sing a little bit. That philosophy and psychology and technology and all the big questions are much more fascinating to me. Well, last July, they finished something that named after the genome project with the DNA. It's called the Connectome Project, where they did the first map of the human brain since 1908, when Brodmann did one, a German guy. And they discovered many more areas. They call them parcellations, because they're regions of the brain. But not the mind, but the brain. The scientists have a harder time with the mind. Technologists like to do deep learning and machine learning. But along the way, using technology to get on the internet and getting on Quora and getting on Skype, I met a guy in Pretoria, South Africa, who had dyslexia as a kid, couldn't read coming out of high school, and found out that he could learn to memorize using a tool called the mnemonics, the method of loci from the 5th century BC, Simonides, by remembering things by associating them with parts of a house. And they call it a memory palace. And he was really instrumental in this last year of my work. This fractal geometry of the brain is terribly exciting, because they've now found, and there's a professor at Harvard Medical School who teaches in Charlestown, does research in his center over there, that he's discovered, after I had figured this out, I read a paper that he'd written where he said, the brain is not spaghetti wired. It's not a mushy thing. In fact, it's a regular grid. When you spread out the whole cortex, it's like a grid. It's like the streets of Manhattan. And the best way to envision the brain is like a cube. And I'm reading this thing in October. I run out of the house down where Pebble used to live, and I see a lady standing down by Hemlock Street. I said, I just discovered the mind. And I trundled along down to Hemlock Place, and she said, I got to tell you, I've discovered that my vision of what the mind looks like has been reconfirmed 4 years before at Mass General Hospital. And and I read it in Raymond Kurzweil's book. She said, well, we know Raymond Kurzweil. Good Cambridge person. In fact, my husband works with him.
No.
And he'll be coming home in just a minute.
Oh, come on.
And he said, and then he drives up. His name's Rich Miner. And he said, and I was using an iPhone. He did not look kindly on my iPhone. He had invented the operating system for the Android with Alexa. I mean, with Google. And it was just a thrilling thing for me. So, what I want to talk about now.
What's interesting, Charlie, is you already had the grid.
I already had it.
You already had the grid.
And so,
Charlie, before you move on, doesn't that mean that it says the fractal geometry of the brain? Does it mean that the brain replicates itself?
there's something called chaos theory. Is that Fraser? I dabbled in chaos theory. And it's the idea that that the patterns you see in regular shapes are actually repeated in nature, but you have to be careful to see how what these patterns are. And the patterns, good example is a fern. I call it the fern fractal phenomenon, because I'm an English major. And the fern is a repeating pattern all the way up. So you see these ferns growing, but the patterns are identical. And if you can see the patterns, if you can see the pattern of a fern, you don't see chaos. And it's right at the cusp of the borderline where you see the you get the real understanding right out there on the border. But see that little YouTube thing up there? Maybe you don't. But I couldn't get by because I'm following on Google a woman who plays the piano, and she just posted a YouTube, so I can't do anything until I check her out. So I tipped her. In the software business, which I'm not a software guy, they talk about the functional requirements to build the software. And the functional requirements are the way that technology people try to say, here's what humans can do, what their brain, mind, and body can do. And the functional framework is they try to reverse engineer human beings and turn them into robots or iPhones. And when you think of them as the brain, mind, and body, the functional framework is to get the iPhone to do what you do, or the robot to do something for you. It's like, just sit back. You don't have to worry about everything will be taken care of for you. This does not sound like a very attractive feature if you like to play tennis or sing songs but what I found was that the frameworks come in many different flavors. I've spent many years on these. And there's the conceptual framework. What is your conceptual framework for your own life? Do you have one? Anybody? Carol?
I have morning routines, I have evening routines, I have certain things that I use to help organize my days and my weeks.
And what would they be?
Things like journaling, things like meditation, things like gratefulness exercises.
Yeah? Anyone have a conceptual framework? Back in 1978, Alvin Toffler wrote a book called Future Shock. Anybody hear of that? And in that book he said, the greatest product of all is not a product or something you can buy. The greatest product is an organizing principle for your life that will help make sense of everything else. And so the idea of coming up with a conceptual framework, pretty important. But as I looked at science, and, they sort of begin with structural frameworks, like the brain that I talked about, the connectome. And then they looked at functional frameworks of what can it do. And you have networkable frameworks, and where are all the dots? You hear on television, well, he didn't connect the dots. Well, where are the dots? Where are the dots that they're telling you to connect? Does anyone have a way of thinking where those dots are? No, it's just it's a metaphor that if you knew where the dots were, like in that two-dimensional drawing thing where a lot of numbers and dots, and you draw them and say, oh, there's a picture there that you didn't see. But you don't have a way of starting. And then how do you connect the dots? And what we're going to talk about tonight is how do we take a tool which allows you to connect the dots and put it into a digital framework